Sarah Hayes stood frozen in the doorway of her small wooden cabin, the humid Georgia air clinging to her skin like a warning. 3 children stood in front of her. Children she had fed with her own hands. Children she had rocked to sleep through fever and nightmares. Children who had called her Mammy for as long as they could speak. Never mother. On that August morning in 1869, federal investigators opened long-sealed plantation records from the Grantham estate. Names were read aloud, dates confirmed, and a truth emerged that caused 2 county officials to quietly leave the room, refusing to sign their names to the report. What Sarah learned that day would shatter everything she believed about her life. It would force her to face a question no woman should ever have to answer. Were the children she raised truly her master's children? Or had she been trapped inside something far darker? Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more true stories pulled from the darkest corners of American history. Share this story with someone who loves historical mysteries, and tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Now let us return to rural Georgia and uncover what really happened on the Grantham estate. Sarah Hayes arrived at the Grantham plantation in the autumn of 1852. She was 19 years old, barefoot, frightened, and visibly pregnant. She had been purchased at auction in Savannah after her previous owner lost everything to debt. 12 enslaved people were sold that day like livestock. Sarah remembered the sound of the gavel more clearly than the faces in the crowd. The Grantham estate stretched across 800 acres of red Georgia clay. Cotton fields rolled outward like an ocean. Corn rows cut the land into perfect lines. At the center stood the main house, 3 stories tall, white paint blinding in the sun, black shutters hanging slightly open like unblinking eyes. Charles Grantham owned it all. He was 43, a widower, and known throughout Burke County for his wealth and silence. His wife had died 3 years earlier during childbirth, along with their newborn son. After that, neighbors said something inside him closed forever. He no longer hosted dinners. No music played from the house at night. Most evenings he stayed alone in his study, drinking whiskey and reviewing ledgers until candlelight flickered out. The enslaved workers whispered that he blamed himself. That he had forced his wife to travel late in her pregnancy. That her death followed him like a ghost through the halls. Sarah was assigned to work inside the house. The overseer, a thin man named Porter with burned red arms, handed her to Dinah, the head of household staff. Dinah had served the Granthams for 26 years. Her back was straight, her hair was gray, her eyes missed nothing. Dinah looked at Sarah's swollen belly and nodded once. Light work, she said. Sewing, vegetables, herbs. You work until you cannot. Then you rest until you can. That is how we survive here. She warned her quietly. Mr. Grantham is not kind. But he is not careless either. Follow the rules and you will live. The rules were simple and terrifying. No one entered through the front door. No one spoke unless spoken to. No one ever entered Mr. Grantham's study. Food was enough. Cabins were solid. The whip was rarely used. It was a prison with invisible walls. In January of 1853, Sarah gave birth to a boy. She named him Thomas. Dinah and an elderly midwife named Ruth attended the birth. 14 hours of pain. No medicine. No mercy. When it was over, Sarah held her son and felt something dangerous. Hope. She returned to work 3 weeks later, tying Thomas to her back with cloth as she moved through the house. Her body learned to sway with her steps so he would sleep. Mr. Grantham never acknowledged the child. To him, Sarah was property. And property that reproduced simply increased in value. Years passed. Sarah became efficient, quiet, invisible when needed. She memorized routines and habits. Mr. Grantham drank coffee black with 2 spoons of sugar. He demanded stiff collars. He refused fish on Wednesdays for reasons no one knew. Thomas grew fast. Too fast. By age 3, he was reading. He learned letters from newspapers used to light fires. Words from discarded receipts. He taught himself silently, watching mouths move, memorizing shapes. Sarah was terrified. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Georgia. Punishments were brutal, but she could not stop him. Instead, she taught him to hide it. Never let them see you know, she whispered. Smart can save your life. But showing it can end it. In the spring of 1855, everything changed. Charles Grantham announced his engagement. Her name was Margaret Yancey. She was 28, the daughter of a judge from Augusta, and she arrived with 14 trunks and eyes that noticed everything. The wedding was massive. 200 guests. Music. Laughter. Food Sarah would never taste. Margaret took control immediately. She changed schedules, reassigned staff, demanded perfection. She was not cruel. She was worse. She was distant. She never looked at Sarah. Never used her name. She called her the girl. Dinah warned her quietly. Stay out of her sight. Some people got reasons. And then, 1 year later, Margaret announced she was pregnant. The house filled with joy. But Sarah felt something else. Fear, because she recognized the look in Margaret's eyes. The same look she had seen in abused animals. The look of someone waiting for pain. And that was when the nightmare truly began. Subscribe for part 2, share this story, and comment below what you think is hidden inside the Grantham records. Part 2. Some babies cry because they are hungry. Some cry because they are afraid. But the baby born at the Grantham estate screamed like she already knew something was terribly wrong. Margaret Grantham's screams during labor echoed through the plantation for nearly a full day, sounds so violent that even the enslaved workers in the fields paused in fear. It was not just pain. It was rage. It was terror. It was something breaking apart. Sarah Hayes heard every scream from the kitchen and felt her own body remember what it meant to suffer. When the crying finally stopped after 23 hours, no one felt relief. Only dread. Before we continue, subscribe to this channel for true stories that history tried to bury. Share this video so these voices are not forgotten. And comment below where you are listening from. Now let us continue part 2 of the Grantham estate. Margaret Grantham withdrew completely during her pregnancy. She stayed inside her darkened rooms, curtains drawn tight, refusing visitors except her 2 personal maids and the doctor who traveled weekly from Augusta. Light hurt her eyes. Sound made her sick. She fainted often, sometimes collapsing without warning and remaining unconscious for hours. The doctor prescribed strict bedrest and laudanum. Margaret accepted both eagerly. Dinah noticed how quickly the bottles emptied. By March of 1857, Margaret went into labor. The house filled with screaming. Not the cries of a woman bringing life into the world, but something harsher. Something furious. Sarah, stirring broth over the fire, felt sick with every sound. She had known pain. She had known fear. But this was different. This sounded like hatred being born alongside a child. When it ended, a baby girl had arrived. They named her Caroline. Margaret refused to look at her. She refused to touch her. She refused to nurse her. She turned her face to the wall and told Charles Grantham to remove the infant immediately. The doctor said it was nervous exhaustion, a common condition after difficult childbirths. He ordered increased laudanum and complete separation from the baby. No one argued. That night, Charles Grantham stood alone in his study holding a screaming newborn. He did not know how to feed her. The wet nurse arranged months earlier had died of pneumonia 2 weeks before the birth. There was no time to find another. Caroline would starve. Dinah solved it with 5 words spoken calmly at the study door. Sarah can nurse the child. Sarah was in her cabin feeding Thomas when Dinah arrived. Thomas was 4 years old and still sometimes needed comfort before sleep. Dinah explained without softness. Mrs. Grantham could not care for the baby. Mr. Grantham required a wet nurse. Sarah had milk. Sarah felt dread settle deep in her chest. She had heard the stories. Women forced to feed white children while their own grew thin and weak. Mothers whose bodies were taken from them piece by piece. But choice had never been part of her life. She wrapped Thomas in a blanket and followed Dinah through the dark. In the nursery, Charles Grantham held Caroline like an object he feared might shatter. The baby screamed until her face turned red. "Feed her," he said. Then he left. Sarah sat and offered her breast. Caroline latched with shocking force. The crying stopped instantly. Thomas whispered, "Mama, hush now," Sarah said softly. "Everything's gonna be all right." She knew she was lying. Caroline fed like she was taking something that belonged to her. Something she would never give back. At first, Sarah returned to her cabin between feedings. Within a week, Charles Grantham decided this was inefficient. Sarah was moved into a small room beside the nursery. Thomas stayed behind. An older woman named Maddie watched him along with other children. Sarah saw her son only briefly each day. Each time he seemed smaller. One evening, he whispered, "Don't forget me." "Never," she promised. But Caroline demanded everything. She fed every 2 hours. Day and night. She screamed with colic until Sarah learned how to soothe her. She developed rashes. She refused to sleep unless held. Sarah slept upright for months. Charles Grantham visited daily. He watched. He never asked about Thomas. Margaret never came. She drifted in laudanum dreams, barely aware of her surroundings. She never asked about Caroline. 6 months later, Margaret died. Too much laudanum. Accident or intention did not matter. At the funeral, Charles Grantham stood beside the grave holding Caroline. Sarah stood back holding Thomas's hand. She felt something she hated herself for. Relief. After Margaret's death, Caroline became the center of the household. And Sarah became her shadow. Subscribe now for part 3. Share this story, and tell us in the comments what you believe Margaret was afraid of. Part 3. Some thefts are loud. They leave bruises, broken bones, screaming victims. But the most devastating thefts happen quietly, over years, until the victim no longer recognizes what has been taken. Sarah Hayes did not realize her life had been stolen piece by piece until freedom finally arrived and she discovered she had nothing left to claim. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel for true stories from America's darkest past. Share this video so these voices are never lost again. And tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Now let us continue part 3 of the Grantham estate. Charles Grantham commissioned a portrait painter every year on Caroline's birthday. Each painting showed her standing a little taller, dressed a little finer, growing into the daughter he never spoke about but quietly obsessed over. The paintings lined the hallway outside his study, a silent record of her existence. When Caroline was 2, Mr. Grantham married again. Her name was Helen Bradford, a widow from Macon. She was 41, practical, sharp-minded, and uninterested in romance. She had already raised 3 children and had no desire to repeat the experience. She ran the household efficiently and without emotion. She did not interfere with Sarah's care of Caroline. 2 years later, everything changed again. Helen became pregnant. The pregnancy was unexpected. The delivery was quick. Twin babies arrived screaming into the world, a boy and a girl named Robert and Elizabeth. Helen recovered quickly and refused to nurse them. She had hired wet nurses before and planned to do so again. But the wet nurse fell ill with influenza. And Sarah was still nursing Caroline. Caroline was 4 years old and refused to be weaned. Mr. Grantham made the decision without discussion. Sarah would nurse all 3 children. Dinah delivered the news with sadness in her eyes. "I know it ain't right," she said quietly. "But you know how it is." Sarah did know. She always knew. She held the twins against her body while Caroline pressed close, feeding them one after another as Thomas watched silently from the doorway. He was 9 years old now. Tall, thin, already working in the fields. "You got 3 children now," Thomas said one evening. "White children. Must be nice having children that matter." Sarah reached for him, but he stepped away. "I understand how it works, Mama." He walked out, leaving Sarah in the dark with Caroline asleep against her shoulder. The truth cut deeper than any whip. The years passed. Caroline grew gentle and curious, calling Sarah Mammy with genuine affection. The twins grew hard. Robert learned cruelty early. Elizabeth learned manipulation even earlier. Sarah cared for them all with exhausting precision because her survival depended on it. If the children were sick, she would be blamed. If they were unhappy, she would be punished. Her existence became tied to their comfort. Thomas drifted away from her. He learned carpentry. He worked long hours. He became quiet and distant, calling her ma'am instead of mama. One night Sarah whispered to Dinah, "I lost him." Dinah shook her head. "You didn't lose him. He's protecting himself." But Sarah blamed someone. She blamed Charles Grantham. She blamed the system. And she blamed herself. In April of 1865, the war ended. General Lee surrendered. The Confederacy collapsed. Charles Grantham gathered all 63 enslaved people in front of the main house. "You're free," he said. "You can stay and work for wages or you can go." No one celebrated. Freedom was a word none of them knew how to use. Sarah stayed. $7 a month. Room and board. Exploitation wrapped in politeness. Thomas left that summer. 16 years old. Savannah. Ships. Possibility. "You write me," Sarah said. "I promise," he replied. She watched him disappear down the road and felt something inside her finally give way. The years after the war were hard. Land was sold. Jewelry was pawned. The household shrank. Caroline grew into a remarkable young woman. Intelligent, kind, curious. The twins grew into something else entirely. Robert was arrogant. Elizabeth was sharp-tongued and calculating. Sarah remained. When Caroline was 14, Sarah became her personal servant. Dresses, hair, social events. Her affection for Caroline never fully disappeared, though she kept it locked away. Thomas wrote occasionally. He had work, friends, a future. Sarah cried quietly over every letter. "Why does Mammy cry?" Elizabeth asked once. "Colored people are too emotional," Robert sneered. "That ain't true," Caroline snapped. "Mammy has family. I have a son," Sarah said softly. The children stared at her. "You have a son," Caroline whispered. "Why didn't I know? You never asked." Something changed that day. Caroline began asking questions. In 1868, Caroline announced she would attend school in Macon. The night before she left, she came to Sarah's room. "Will you still be here when I come back?" "I expect so," Sarah replied. "I don't have anywhere else to go." In the spring of 1869, a letter arrived. Federal investigators demanded plantation records. Births, purchases, names. Mr. Grantham raged. Sarah felt a chill she could not explain. Because some secrets cannot survive daylight. Subscribe for part 4, share this story, and comment below what you think those records will reveal. Part 4. Some truths are so dangerous they are hidden not to protect the innocent, but to protect the powerful. And when those truths are finally uncovered, they do not just change the past. They poison the present. Sarah Hayes did not yet know it, but the papers locked inside Charles Grantham's study were about to destroy everything she thought she understood about motherhood, love, and the children she had raised with her own body. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel for true stories history tried to erase. Share this video so these voices are heard. And tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Now let us step inside the Grantham house one last time before the truth comes out. The letter from the Federal Bureau sat on Charles Grantham's desk like an accusation. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, as if hiding it might make it disappear. For weeks, he delayed responding. He claimed illness. He claimed missing documents. He claimed confusion. But the investigators returned anyway. 2 men arrived in August of 1869. They wore plain suits and carried leather satchels filled with forms and official seals. They were polite, calm, unmoved by Grantham's anger. They asked for the plantation ledgers, birth records, purchase records, private household notes. Charles Grantham protested loudly. "These are family matters," he said. "Not government business." One of the men replied evenly. "Sir, these records concern human beings. The law requires compliance." Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway as Dinah escorted the men toward the study. No one had entered that room in nearly 20 years. The door opened. Dust filled the air. Inside, shelves lined every wall, stacked with leather-bound books, journals, and folded papers tied with string. Everything was meticulously labeled. Dates, names, values, lives reduced to ink. The investigators worked for 2 days. They copied names. They cross-checked dates. They whispered to each other in low voices. On the 3rd day, one of them asked for Sarah. She was brought to the dining room and told to sit. Her hands trembled in her lap. "We have some questions about your children," the man said gently. Sarah's heart began to race. "My child," she corrected softly. "I have one son." The man exchanged a look with his partner. "According to these records," he said slowly, "you gave birth to 4 children on this plantation." The room tilted. 4, Sarah whispered. That is correct, Thomas. And 3 others. Caroline, Robert, Elizabeth. Sarah could not breathe. No, she said. That isn't possible. The men placed a ledger on the table and opened it. The page was yellowed with age. Her name was written clearly. Sarah, female, purchased 1852, pregnant. Then beneath it, male child born January 1853. Female child born March 1857. Male child born July 1861. Female child born July 1861. Father listed as C. Grantham. Sarah felt her vision darken. They are not my children, she whispered. They are his. The investigator's voice was heavy. Legally, under the law at the time, children born to enslaved women belonged to the owner. But biologically, these children were born of you. Sarah's body shook. Caroline, the twins, her milk, her blood, her pain, they were not simply children she had nursed. They were her children. Charles Grantham entered the room then. His face was white. Enough, he said sharply. The investigators stood. Sir, one of them said, these records indicate repeated sexual exploitation of an enslaved woman over a period of nearly 10 years. You will lower your voice, Grantham snapped. The man did not. Sir, you will answer for this. Charles Grantham laughed bitterly. Answer to who? The past is the past. The law disagrees, the investigator replied. Sarah sat frozen. Her mind raced backward. Margaret's screams. Margaret's refusal to touch Caroline. Helen's indifference. The way Caroline clung to her. The twins' cruelty. Thomas's withdrawal. She saw it all clearly now. She had been made to nurse her own children without knowing it. She had been forced to give her love to children who were taken from her the moment they were born. She had been erased as a mother while being used as one. The investigators left that afternoon. They did not shake Grantham's hand. They did not speak to Sarah again. But the damage was done. That night, Sarah returned to her cabin. She sat alone in the dark. She did not cry. She felt hollow. 2 days later, Caroline returned from Macon unexpectedly. She found the house tense and quiet. She went to Sarah's room. Mammy, she said, something's wrong. Sarah looked at her. Really looked. The familiar curve of the face. The eyes. The mouth. My child, Sarah whispered before she could stop herself. Caroline froze. What did you say? Sarah stood slowly. You were born of me, Caroline. The silence was unbearable. That's not funny, Caroline said. I would never joke about this. Caroline backed away. You're confused. Ask your father, Sarah said quietly. Caroline did. Charles Grantham slapped her. That was the answer. Caroline ran. She did not return for 3 days. When she came back, her face was changed. She went to Sarah's room again. Is it true? She whispered. Sarah nodded. Caroline collapsed into her arms. For the first time in her life, she cried like a child. I called you Mammy, she sobbed. You were my mother. Sarah held her. Always, always. But the truth had come too late. Because some bonds cannot survive the lies that created them. Subscribe for part 5, share this story, and tell us in the comments what you think Caroline will do now that she knows the truth. Part 5. Some truths do not bring peace. They bring rage. They bring grief. And sometimes they bring a hunger for justice so powerful it threatens to burn everything to the ground. Caroline Grantham learned the truth of her birth in silence, and silence became the most terrifying thing she had ever known. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel for true stories pulled from the darkest corners of American history. Share this story so it cannot be buried again. And tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Now let us continue part 5 of the Grantham estate. After Caroline collapsed into Sarah's arms, neither of them spoke for a long time. The world outside the small room continued as if nothing had changed. Cicadas sang. Footsteps passed in the hall. A door closed somewhere down the corridor. But inside that room, 2 lives had split open. Caroline finally pulled back and looked at Sarah's face. Not as Mammy, not as a servant, but as a woman, a mother. How long did you know? Caroline asked. I found out 3 days ago, Sarah replied. From the records. Caroline swallowed hard. And my father. He knew from the beginning. Sarah nodded. Caroline stood up so suddenly the chair behind her tipped over. He did this to you, she said, her voice shaking. Over and over. He took your children. He made you feed us. Sarah reached for her, but Caroline stepped away. I don't know who I am anymore, she said. Everything I believed is poisoned. She turned and left. Caroline did not speak to her father again. For weeks, she stayed locked in her room. Meals were brought and left untouched. Helen tried to intervene, but Caroline refused to open the door. Robert mocked her grief. Elizabeth watched quietly. Charles Grantham did nothing. When he did speak of Caroline, it was only to complain about her disobedience. Sarah moved through the house like a ghost. Every memory now carried new meaning. Every cradle she had rocked. Every fever she had cooled. Every lullaby she had whispered. They were hers, and they had been stolen. One evening, Caroline appeared in the kitchen. Her face was pale but determined. I am leaving, she said. Sarah's heart clenched. Leaving. I am going to Savannah, Caroline continued. I am going to find my brother. Sarah stared at her. Thomas. You know where he is. I have his letters, Sarah said carefully. Caroline nodded. Then you will give them to me. Sarah hesitated. He may not want to see you. I don't care, Caroline said quietly. He deserves to know the truth. And so do I. Sarah handed her the letters. Caroline left before dawn with a single trunk and no farewell to her father. When Charles Grantham discovered her absence, his fury shook the house. He accused Sarah. You poisoned her mind, he shouted. You filled her head with lies. Sarah stood still. They were never lies. Grantham raised his hand, then stopped. For the first time, Sarah saw fear in his eyes. Because the truth had escaped the plantation. Caroline found Thomas in Savannah after 3 days of searching. He was taller now, broader, hardened by work and independence. When she said his name, he turned slowly. Who are you? He asked. I am your sister, she said. No, you are not. I am, she replied. And I wish with everything in me that I was not. They sat for hours. She told him everything. The records, the nursing, the lies. Thomas listened without expression. When she finished, he stood. I always knew something was wrong, he said. I just never thought it was this. He did not embrace her. He did not forgive her. But he did not turn her away. That was something. Back at the plantation, the investigators returned. This time with more authority. Questions became accusations. Witnesses were interviewed. Dinah spoke. So did Pearl. So did others who had seen Margaret's terror. Who had noticed the timing of births. Who had wondered but never dared to say. Charles Grantham was charged. Not for everything. The law was still cruelly limited. But enough. Enough to stain his name. Enough to strip him of respect. Enough to begin his fall. Helen left him. She took Robert and Elizabeth to Macon and never looked back. The plantation collapsed. Land was sold. Furniture auctioned. The house emptied room by room. Sarah was offered wages to stay. She refused. For the first time in her life, she said no. She left with a small bag and a destination. Savannah. To find her son. To find her daughter. To find whatever life might still be hers. When she arrived, Thomas was waiting. He did not smile, but he took her hand. Caroline stood beside him, uncertain and broken. Sarah looked at them both. Her children, all of them. The horror was not over. But the silence was. Subscribe for part 6. Share this story, and tell us in the comments what justice should look like when the law fails the innocent. Part 6. Some secrets refuse to die. They linger in empty rooms. They linger in broken hearts. And sometimes, they follow you across states, across years, until the past demands its reckoning. Sarah Hayes had reunited with Thomas and Caroline, but the shadows of the Grantham estate had not loosened their grip. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel for true stories that history tried to bury. Share this story so these voices are not forgotten. And tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Now let us continue part 6 of the Grantham estate. The reunion was quiet. Thomas had grown into a man shaped by struggle. His hands bore the scars of work in Savannah's shipyards. His eyes held the knowledge of a life lived without ease. Caroline had grown into a young woman filled with fire and curiosity. Together, they were proof of what Sarah had always feared: the system could break the body, but not the soul. For days, they spoke in fragments. Questions asked cautiously, answers offered carefully. Sarah listened more than she spoke. She wanted to hear everything. The letters Thomas had written over the years were only part of the story. Caroline asked about Margaret Grantham, about Helen, about the twins Robert and Elizabeth, about the life she had left behind without fully understanding it. Sarah told her what she could. She told her the truth about the nursing, about the separation, about the pain she had endured in silence. She told her how the plantation had taken her children without mercy, how she had fed them while watching her own boy drift away. Caroline did not cry. She did not scream. She listened, absorbing each word as if storing it for later, as if preparing to fight the world herself. Thomas finally spoke. He wanted to know why they had been kept apart. Why Sarah had never told him about his sisters. "I was afraid," Sarah admitted. "Afraid you would think less of me. Afraid I could not protect you all. Afraid that the world would punish me if I dared to speak." Thomas nodded. He understood. And yet, understanding did not heal the years lost. For the first time, Sarah felt the weight of freedom in a way she never had. Freedom was not simple. Freedom was not automatic. It was fragile. The three of them stayed together in Savannah for weeks, living in a small rented house near the docks. Thomas worked during the day. Caroline attended a local seminary for young women. And Sarah began to imagine a life for herself that did not revolve entirely around the children she had lost to another man's desire. But the shadows of the past were not so easily dismissed. One morning, a letter arrived. It was from a lawyer representing the remaining Grantham estate. The language was careful, polite, almost cold. It demanded the immediate return of all records, papers, and documents that had been taken during the federal investigation. It hinted at legal consequences, though in practice, the system had little interest in punishing someone like Sarah. Thomas read the letter aloud. His jaw tightened. Caroline's hands shook as she folded it neatly and tucked it away. Sarah simply stared. "You can't let them intimidate you," Thomas said. "I won't," Sarah replied quietly. But the letter marked the beginning of a new horror. The Grantham children, Robert and Elizabeth, were still young, still impressionable, and still in the household of men and women who had been taught to value status above morality. Word traveled slowly, but soon, they learned that Caroline had discovered the truth. They arrived in Savannah, not with threats, but with questions. Why had she left? Why had she abandoned them? Why had she been influenced by lies? Caroline met them in the yard. She stood tall, eyes steady, unflinching. "I left because I had to," she said. "I had to find my mother and brother." Robert laughed bitterly. "You call that family? You call her mother?" Caroline's lips pressed into a line. "I call her my mother. And she is." Elizabeth sneered. "That is ridiculous. She is a servant, nothing more." Sarah stepped forward. "I am their mother," she said calmly. The twins faltered. They had never heard her speak like this. Never seen her take possession of herself. And for the first time, Caroline felt a surge of power. She realized that the woman who had nurtured her, who had carried her through every illness, every heartbreak, every day of her early life, was not simply a servant. She was a mother, a woman who had survived decades of oppression. The confrontation did not end in violence, but it did not end in reconciliation. The twins returned home, Robert with anger simmering, Elizabeth with eyes cold and calculating. Caroline turned to Sarah. "Are they dangerous?" she asked. "Dangerous in their way," Sarah replied. "But only if you let them be." Over the next months, Sarah, Thomas, and Caroline rebuilt their lives. Thomas secured better work in the port, while Caroline excelled in her studies. Sarah found part-time work helping women with children, passing on the knowledge she had accumulated at the Grantham estate. Yet, every day, the memory of the Grantham house lingered. Every time she washed a child's face, every time she prepared a meal, she remembered how it had been twisted from her by someone who should have protected her, someone who had claimed her children as his own without consent. And she realized something terrifying. History would not remember her suffering. The world would not honor her sacrifices. Her pain would be invisible, just as the law had made invisible the lives of those it enslaved. Caroline was the first to see it clearly. One evening, she said quietly, "I will make sure they know. I will tell everyone." Sarah shook her head. "No, Caroline, you must be careful. The world is cruel." Caroline looked at her mother with fire in her eyes. "I don't care. People need to know what they did. People need to know what they took from us." Thomas placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "I agree, but we must be smart. We survive first. We speak second." Sarah nodded. She felt pride. For the first time in her life, she felt that her children, her true children, were ready to fight the world the way she never could. And she knew that the Grantham legacy, the horror of the estate, the theft of mothers and children, could no longer remain buried. The next step would not be easy. It would require courage, cunning, and a willingness to confront a past most would rather forget. But they were ready. Subscribe for part 7, share this story, and comment below how you would fight for justice if the law failed you. Part 7. Some truths are heavier than chains. They do not break easily. They do not fade with time. They follow you into freedom, into safety, into the very moments you think you have escaped the past. Sarah Hayes, Thomas, and Caroline had fled the shadows of the Grantham estate. But the estate's secrets were not finished with them. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel for true stories America tried to bury. Share this story so it is never forgotten. And tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Now let us continue part 7 of the Grantham estate. Caroline had begun writing. At first, small entries in a leather journal. Names, dates, memories, facts she could confirm. Then stories. Stories of her early years, of the cradle room, of the nights Sarah had held her when she could not sleep. Stories of the twins, their cruelty, and the weight of living in a house built on lies. Sarah watched her daughter write and felt a mixture of pride and terror. This was not just memory. This was evidence. Thomas suggested she type the entries, making multiple copies. "Keep them safe," he said. "One day, people need to know the truth." Caroline agreed. She wanted the world to see what had been done. To understand that the cruelty of men like Charles Grantham could not be erased by death or time. Meanwhile, the Grantham estate still existed in fragments. Robert and Elizabeth were living under the care of distant relatives in Georgia. They were young adults now. Their father's power had diminished, but they still carried the lessons of privilege and cruelty he had taught them. Caroline wrote with purpose. She described the systematic way enslaved women were used as wet nurses, the way their children were stolen, and the way their bodies were taken without consent. She wrote of the fear that had shaped Sarah's every choice. It was a difficult thing to read. Even for Sarah, every word reopened old wounds. But Caroline wrote because she had to. Because silence had allowed injustice to thrive for generations. One day, while Caroline was at school, a man arrived at their small Savannah home. He was well-dressed, official-looking. His shoes clicked on the wooden floors. Thomas met him at the door. He introduced himself as a journalist from a northern newspaper. He had heard rumors about the Grantham estate, about the abuse, about the stolen children, about Sarah Hayes. He asked to speak to Sarah. Sarah was hesitant, but Thomas insisted. "You have to tell the truth," he said. So she did. For hours, Sarah spoke. About her childhood. About the auction that brought her to the Grantham plantation. About Thomas. About Caroline, Robert, and Elizabeth. About the years she had spent nursing the children she had borne and the children she had not. She spoke of Margaret and Helen, of the laudanum, of the endless work, of the fear and sorrow and small joys that had filled her life. By the time she finished, the journalist had tears in his eyes. "This story will be told," he said. "People need to know." It was the first time Sarah felt some sense of release. But the past was not done with them yet. Letters and newspapers traveled slowly in 1870, but the news eventually reached the Grantham children. Robert was furious. He demanded Caroline stop writing. He threatened legal action. Elizabeth tried to manipulate her into silence with promises and false apologies. Caroline ignored them. She continued to write, each day uncovering more of the truth, documenting every detail she could remember or confirm. Sarah helped her where she could. She remembered faces, conversations, and dates that Caroline had forgotten. Together, they created a record that could not be denied. Meanwhile, Thomas worked to protect them. He contacted allies he had met in Savannah. Black ministers, local business owners, and activists who had once helped freed people find jobs and homes during Reconstruction. The network they built was small but powerful. They would not be silenced. Months passed. Caroline's writing grew more focused. She began sending articles and excerpts to newspapers in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Northern editors were shocked at the level of detail and at the audacity of the story. One newspaper published a front-page article about the Grantham estate, naming Charles Grantham and his practices, including the use of enslaved women as wet nurses and the theft of their children. The reaction was immediate. Letters poured in from readers horrified at the revelations. Some offered money, some offered protection, some offered work, but others threatened. Letters arrived in Augusta and Burke County. Threats against the family, against Sarah, against Caroline. The twins had not forgotten. Robert sent a messenger demanding the immediate cessation of Caroline's writings. Elizabeth tried to bribe the local postmaster to stop mail from reaching Savannah. But Thomas and Caroline were careful. They moved some of their belongings. They changed addresses when needed. They relied on the community that had formed around them. Sarah, though, feared for her children more than ever. She had survived the estate. She had survived slavery. She had survived separation and betrayal. But she had not survived losing her children to hate. One evening, Caroline came to her. "Mama," she said, "they are trying to scare me." "I know," Sarah said. "And we will not let them." Caroline nodded. Her resolve was strong. "We will tell the story," she said. "Every word, every memory, every truth." Sarah placed her hand on Caroline's shoulder. "You are brave," she said. "Braver than I was." The two sisters, mother and daughter, would face the world together. And Thomas would be their shield. For the first time in years, Sarah believed they might survive the past. And maybe, just maybe, justice would find a way to catch up with the cruelty they had endured. Subscribe for Part 8. Share this story. And comment below what you would do if you uncovered a secret that changed everything you believed about your family. Part 8. Some truths demand courage that most people never have. They demand facing danger. They demand staring into eyes that would rather kill the messenger than acknowledge their own guilt. Sarah Hayes and her children had uncovered one such truth. But the more they revealed, the closer the past came to them. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel for true stories from America's darkest history. Share this story so it cannot be buried. And tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Now let us continue Part 8 of the Grantham estate. The months after Caroline's writing went public were tense. Letters arrived daily. Some were full of praise and support. Others were threats. Robert and Elizabeth were relentless. They contacted distant relatives, lawyers, even local officials. They demanded silence, punishment, retraction. But Caroline would not stop. She published excerpts of her mother's life. She told the world about the stolen children, the wet nursing, the forced labor, and the quiet cruelty of the Grantham household. Sarah helped her carefully, correcting names and dates, recalling conversations, memories, and small truths that only she could know. The community in Savannah rallied. Black ministers, shopkeepers, and neighbors offered protection. They watched the street, warned of strangers, and ensured that no harm would come to Sarah or her children. But the threats grew bolder. One evening, a brick smashed through the window of their small home. The note attached read simply, "Leave now or pay the price." Caroline read it aloud. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "We will not be silenced," she said. Thomas locked the door and checked the windows. They were all alert, wary, but not broken. The past was trying to claim them, but they had survived the plantation, the stolen years, and the oppressive silence. They could survive this too. Caroline continued to write. Every day, every night, her words became sharper, more precise. The story of the Grantham estate spread across state lines. Northern newspapers picked it up. The story became a cause for abolitionist historians, Reconstruction activists, and sympathetic readers. But in Georgia, the story stirred anger. Robert and Elizabeth became figures of local outrage. Their father had died quietly a year before, leaving them with some land and influence. They used it to intimidate anyone connected to Sarah and Caroline. One afternoon, Thomas received a visitor. A lawyer from Burke County. He demanded that Sarah and Caroline cease publishing or face criminal charges. Thomas read the papers aloud. They claim you are defaming the Grantham family. That you are publishing lies about your past. Caroline folded her arms. The truth cannot be lies, she said. The lawyer hesitated. He was used to dealing with timid witnesses. This girl was not timid. You are aware that in Georgia, the law favors the wealthy, he said. You could be imprisoned. Caroline met his gaze without flinching. I am aware, she said. But I will not hide the truth. The lawyer left. For the first time, Thomas felt a swell of pride. Caroline was no longer a child. She was a woman prepared to fight injustice with nothing but her voice. Sarah watched silently. Her own courage had been forged in fear and survival. Now it passed to her children. But fear never truly leaves. One night, while Caroline and Thomas slept, Sarah heard footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate, she peered through the window. Shadows moved along the street. She gripped the edge of the windowsill. It was Robert and Elizabeth, prowling, watching, waiting. Sarah's mind raced. The law could not protect them. Only vigilance, only courage, only community. She woke Thomas quietly. They watched together until the shadows passed. Morning brought a new strategy. Caroline began sending letters to newspapers farther north, to cities like Boston and Philadelphia, places where her words could not be threatened. Thomas contacted old friends in Savannah. Men who had fought for Reconstruction, men who understood power and intimidation. Sarah helped with logistics, organizing their documents, verifying records, making the story bulletproof. It was exhausting, it was terrifying, and it was necessary. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Sympathetic voices spoke out. Local papers in Georgia, at first silent, began publishing cautious articles supporting Caroline's claims. Influential men who had once supported the Granthams began distancing themselves. The twins' influence waned. Their threats became empty. Their letters unread. Caroline found strength she never knew she had. She spoke publicly at small gatherings, recounting her story and her mother's sacrifices. People listened. People believed. Sarah watched with tears in her eyes. Her daughter was carrying the story of their lives, their suffering, and their courage into the world. And yet, the scars of the past remained. Caroline and Thomas could leave the house only with caution. Sarah never left alone. They moved in careful routines. They trusted only a few allies. Every day reminded them that freedom was never guaranteed. But every day also reminded them that truth could not be imprisoned. And that was enough. Caroline's writings reached other families who had suffered similar horrors. Letters came from women who had been forced into wet nursing, who had lost children, who had endured the silence of a society unwilling to see them. They shared stories. They offered support. Sarah, Thomas, and Caroline realized they were not alone. The Grantham estate had been a single horror, but it had been part of a larger system, a system built on silence, exploitation, and stolen lives. And the system would be exposed. Sarah began teaching Caroline and Thomas practical skills: bookkeeping, law basics, writing, and record keeping. They needed to be ready for anything. Every day was a lesson. Every task was preparation. And through it all, the bond between mother and children grew stronger. It was a bond forged not by convenience, not by circumstance, but by survival, truth, and shared courage. The Grantham legacy of cruelty had not destroyed them. It had only made them stronger. The story of their lives, the horror they had endured, and the courage they now displayed would continue to spread. And no threat, no shadow, no wealthy heir could stop it. Subscribe for Part 9, share this story, and comment below if you think truth alone can overcome decades of lies and cruelty. Part 9. Some secrets are more dangerous when they are revealed. They stir anger in those who wish to remain hidden. They give courage to the powerless and fear to the powerful. Sarah Hayes and her children were about to learn just how explosive the truth could be. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel for America's darkest true stories. Share this story so others never forget. And tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Now let us continue part 9 of the Grantham estate. By 1871, the story of the Grantham estate had reached newspapers across the North. Caroline's writing, bolstered by Sarah's memories, had become a series of articles that shocked readers. Families who had lost loved ones, women who had been stolen from, and men who had watched injustice go unchecked finally had a record of the horrors they had endured. But in Georgia, the response was different. Robert and Elizabeth were furious. Their pride, their privilege, and their illusions of innocence had been shattered. Robert wrote to lawyers demanding retractions. Elizabeth tried bribing officials to shut the presses. Threats escalated. Strange men were seen near Sarah's home. Shadows at night. Footsteps. Watching. Waiting. Sarah, Thomas, and Caroline became hypervigilant. They knew the danger was real. And yet, they could not stop. The truth demanded to be told. One evening, Caroline returned home from the seminary in Macon with an envelope in her hand. It was thick, heavy, and stamped with the seal of the local courthouse. Sarah's heart sank as Caroline handed it over. It was a legal summons. The Grantham heirs claimed defamation. They demanded Caroline appear in court and cease all publications immediately. Thomas read it aloud. Their faces were pale. Sarah clenched her fists. For the first time, she felt anger boil inside her. This was not just about words. This was about power, about control, about trying to erase lives that had already suffered too much. But Caroline did not waver. She had prepared for this moment. Every letter, every newspaper clipping, every memory Sarah had shared had been meticulously documented. They had evidence. In court, the twins tried to paint Sarah and Caroline as liars. They claimed exaggeration, deceit, and manipulation. But Sarah and Caroline had truth on their side. They recounted the stolen years, the wet nursing, the stolen children, the forced labor, the illnesses, the fear, and the quiet cruelty that had ruled the Grantham household for decades. The judge listened carefully. Witnesses who had worked at the estate were called. Old letters were read aloud. Newspapers from northern cities were cited. Robert and Elizabeth's influence crumbled as the truth became undeniable. The court ruled in favor of Caroline and Sarah. The defamation claims were dismissed. It was a victory, but it came with consequences. Word spread quickly. The Grantham name was tarnished in Georgia. Social circles whispered. Some families turned their backs. Robert and Elizabeth left the area, disgraced and bitter. Sarah, Thomas, and Caroline finally had some measure of peace. But the scars of the past were still visible. Caroline became a voice for other women who had been forced into wet nursing. She published essays, spoke at gatherings, and worked with organizations helping freed people rebuild their lives. Thomas used his skills in the port and as a clerk to support the family. He also helped with Caroline's work, ensuring that the story of the Grantham estate reached as many people as possible. Sarah, now older and quieter, finally allowed herself to rest. She took long walks along the Savannah River, reflecting on the years she had endured, the children she had raised, and the justice they had finally found. But there was one question that lingered, one truth that had been kept hidden for nearly 2 decades. When the federal investigators had unsealed the Grantham plantation records in 1869, they had found evidence that shocked even the officials. Names, dates, and transactions that suggested Sarah had not been entirely correct about the parentage of some of the children she had cared for. For years, she had believed that Caroline, Robert, and Elizabeth were all the biological children of Charles Grantham or Helen Bradford. But the records hinted at something far more sinister. Sarah discovered the letters, the ledgers, and the notations. They suggested that her own body, her own life, had been used in ways she could scarcely comprehend. The truth was almost too heavy to bear. She spent nights awake, questioning, remembering, and trying to reconcile what she had lived with what the documents now revealed. Thomas and Caroline were unaware of the full implications. Sarah knew she had to protect them from this new horror, at least until she understood it herself. Yet, She also knew the time would come when the truth must be faced. It was a question of survival, justice, and memory. And Sarah, after all she had endured, understood that some truths could not remain buried. The Grantham estate had tried to take everything from her. Her children, her life, her dignity. But Sarah had survived. Her children had survived. And now, nearly 20 years later, the truth was finally theirs to hold. Subscribe for part 10, the final part. Share this story, and comment below if you could survive decades of lies and cruelty and still have the courage to fight for justice. Part 10 Final part. Some truths cannot be ignored. Some secrets demand answers even when those answers are more terrifying than the questions. For Sarah Hayes, that day had come. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel for the darkest true stories from America. Share this story so history is never forgotten. And tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Now let us continue part 10, the final chapter of the Grantham estate. The summer of 1869 was hot and heavy. The smell of red Georgia clay mixed with the faint scent of jasmine from the nearby gardens. Sarah sat at the small wooden table in her cabin, staring at the federal documents that had arrived weeks earlier. Her hands trembled. These papers held the answers to questions she had avoided for years. Questions about her children, her life, and the cruel manipulations that had defined the Grantham estate. Caroline returned from her seminary studies for the summer. She entered the cabin quietly, carrying her books. She noticed the stack of papers and the tension in Sarah's posture. "Mama," she asked softly, "what is it?" Sarah looked up. Her eyes were wet. "I think it is time," she said. "Time to know everything." The documents revealed the details of births, purchases, and sales of enslaved people. They included ledgers kept meticulously by Charles Grantham and later Helen Bradford, notes on nursing arrangements, and the dates of every child born on the estate. As Sarah read, a horror unfolded that she could scarcely believe. Caroline, Robert, and Elizabeth were all biological children of Charles Grantham and his wives as she had believed. But there were other names. Names of children born to Sarah herself that she had never known had existed. Children taken immediately after birth, sold, or assigned to other households. Her own flesh and blood, removed from her care, hidden in plain sight. She felt as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Caroline watched silently. She knew this was not just another story. This was history coming alive, personal and devastating. Sarah read aloud, voice shaking, telling Caroline about the children she had never known. Children born in the estate's shadows, taken as soon as their first cries were heard. The reality of her life, once shaped only by survival, was now painted with deliberate cruelty. Caroline's hand gripped Sarah's. "Mama," she whispered. "I know," Sarah said. "I know. And I survived. And you survived." Thomas arrived later that afternoon. He read the documents with quiet intensity. He was tall, strong, and capable, but even he could not hide the sorrow that came with knowing how many children had been stolen from their mother. "We need to make this public," he said. "The world needs to know." Sarah nodded. She had fought for justice before, through letters, newspapers, and court battles. Now it was a matter of memory, of history. The children who were lost could not speak, but their story could. Together, they contacted historians, abolitionist writers, and journalists. They organized the documents, confirmed dates and names, and created a record that could not be challenged. It was difficult. The weight of the truth pressed down on Sarah in ways she had never imagined. But the knowledge also carried power. Power to expose cruelty. Power to protect memory. Power to ensure that those stolen lives were not forgotten. The story of the Grantham estate became a sensation. Newspapers from Boston to New York covered it. Lectures and public readings were held. Families who had been enslaved and separated from their children finally found hope that their stories could be verified. Robert and Elizabeth, once proud heirs of a wealthy estate, had no influence left. Their attempts to intimidate, to silence, or to erase the truth had failed completely. Sarah felt a strange peace. She had endured pain, fear, and loss. She had survived slavery, oppression, and decades of exploitation. And now, at last, her story was free. Caroline continued writing, ensuring that every detail, every name, every act of cruelty and survival was recorded for posterity. Thomas worked tirelessly to protect their family and help others connect with the lost histories of their relatives. And Sarah, she finally allowed herself to rest. She walked along the riverbank at dusk, feeling the warm breeze and the distant calls of birds returning home. For the first time in decades, she did not feel hunted, invisible, or powerless. She felt alive. She thought of the children she had lost, the children she had raised, and the family she had protected. She thought of Caroline and Thomas, both strong and brave, both carrying the torch of truth and justice. The Grantham estate had tried to define her life, to control her body, to take her children. But in the end, it had failed. History could not erase what she had endured. And the truth, once revealed, could never be hidden again. Sarah Hayes, the woman who had survived unspeakable cruelty, who had nurtured children not her own while grieving those stolen from her, had finally won a measure of justice. And in that justice, she found freedom that no system, no tyrant, no estate could ever take away. Subscribe to the channel to hear more true stories that history tried to bury. Share this story so it is remembered and honored. And comment below how far you would go to protect the truth even when the world tried to bury it. The story of Sarah Hayes, her lost children, and the Grantham estate ends here, but the lessons of courage, survival, and truth remain for every generation.